I am an organic farmer. I think biological farming is the way forward, but certainly while the margins are there, we will definitely continue farming organically. So just running down there, that's a few things that have happened over the years. The cow in the middle, that's High Point Chief Mary. She actually gave 176 tonnes of milk, classified excellent 95E, 17 first prizes at the Royal Show, and she was actually my mentor through the high yielding days. She always told me what I got right and what I got wrong in terms of the ration, and she was, really important to me through those high yielding days. And it's for me, I wouldn't say I like reading, but I do like looking and understanding what's happening on farm. And if I can understand it, I'm happy to go with it and promote it. So all those pictures on that page, they're basically organic crops, and we'll talk about those a little later on. The actual business, the main business where I'm based is Keithorpe Lakes Farm. There's 350 autumn calved cows there, Holsteins, on 730 organic acres. Glebe Farm, I actually bought some of that in partnership. We've got 200, well, it's about 200 cows there. That's organic. And then 2 years ago, I was in the right place at the right time and went on to an organic farm buying some hay. They weren't very positive about the situation. Offered them a JV. They said yes, they'd go for it. So we then added another 1,700 acres of organic land at that point. So that one's up and running. And then the second manor farm, that's actually a conventional unit. And the dynamics of that one in terms of the grazing platform and the land area, it actually lends itself to being conventional at this moment in time. We've also got a yogurt business on that farm, and if I was to convert it to organic, I've got to change the yogurt business as well. But I think that could well come in a couple of years' time. But really today, I want to talk about the health, and it's the health of the whole system. And it's vital that we get the health of the whole system running together. So the health of the farm, starting off with the health of the soil, is fundamental to our business. Healthy plants, healthy cows, healthy profit, and people and farm, and we roll on. So that's what it's about, really, building a healthy business. So in 2012, I was actually fortunate to do a Nuffield Scholarship, and really at that moment I was actually questioning my organic future and whether I should get out, because there were a lot of good guys getting out of organic dairy. They were making more money conventionally, and we were under pressure at that point because I'd converted to organic 2005 and hadn't really done anything, and we just sort of plateaued out and needed to drive it on further. So I applied for the scholarship. Actually went off to Denmark, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, France, and then America. And it was really Gary Zimmer, who you had speaking here last year, that actually helped me put it all together and decide that, yes, I was passionate about an organic future and thought we could actually drive productivity on a fair bit further from there. So going around the world, a lot of the good guys, they dumped the basic NPK soil analysis, and we're looking at the Albrecht-based saturation levels. And so this is a picture, this is an analysis of some of our best paddocks. And you can actually see this is the base saturation, the desired level, and this is where we are. So we're fairly high calcium, low magnesium. So we need to adopt a fertilizer policy to address that. And we're going on with foliar feeds that we'll talk in a little bit with magnesium. But if you've got a very high magnesium soil, and we've got it within our discussion group, we've got some farmers there with very high magnesium soils, what you need to be doing is addressing or creating a fertilizer policy to address that. You're not going to change your base saturation levels, but certainly you need a fertilizer policy to address that. And certainly if you're on high mag soils and you're struggling to grow legumes, the chances are you've not got enough free calcium in the soil. So the likes of gypsum or calcium carbonate, you need to be looking at those. Yeah. So yeah, this is just highlighting what's on that analysis. So our organic matters, we were running, before we actually converted to organic, we were running at the sort of 2s. The farm had been arable since the war. An awful lot of nitrogen fertilizer had been thrown about, poor cultivation practices, and they burnt off an awful lot of organic matter. We came there in 1990 with the cows. We went a long way in building that organic matter, but it wasn't until we hit organic that we actually really pushed that on again. And that was because we weren't using the nitrogen fertilizer. Cal-mag ratio, ideally that should be about 70 to 12. And as you can see, we're high in calcium, so our soils do flocculate pretty well. And then the pH, in the organic situation, that stabilizes, just sits there, 6.9, hasn't changed for the last 14 years. Yeah, so we don't need to be putting lime on as such, but we still need to be, addressing the calcium in some fields. These are the big ones, though. And Christine Jones alluded to it this morning, that we don't need to be putting P and K on in our soils. And when you look at the tonnages of P and K that we've actually got in our soils, we've got massive amount there. And it's just about getting our soils working so that we can actually utilize that P and K. So we've not put any P and K on, apart from the odd bit of slurry, for the last 14 years. And our crops certainly aren't short of phosphorus. So it's a bit of you've got to get your soils working before you can go cold turkey, not putting anything on and converting to organic. But our soils, certainly in the UK, and I believe, over here, you're pretty similar. There's only 9 countries in the world that are self-sufficient in water, and then we've got deep, rich, mineralized soils that we can work with. So we are in a hell of a position to produce a hell of a lot of quality food going forward. And we really need to embrace that and start shouting about it to policy and government and making them understand, the assets that we actually have. So that was the soil analysis. And then I went on a Regen Ag course because I wanted to try and understand how the soil was functioning. And this was basically soil chromatography. Very simple process. You make up a soil solution, you have a filter paper, and then a filter paper straw in the center, and the filter paper straw sucks up the solution. The heaviest materials stop first. So in the center, you've got the mineral zone, you've then got the organic matter, and then you've got the biology around the outside, and then you've got the rays linking it all together. And on this course, there was about 40 people, range of people on that course, biodynamic gardeners, professors, and everything else. But this was probably the best chromo there that we produced, and there was 120 chromos, and I was, a pretty intensive dairy farmer. But what it really highlighted to me was the synergies between cows and ruminants and the soil, and we're actually working with microbes, and it's about feeding microbes for the soil health. Yeah. So when you look at the soil food web, on the Nuffield, I was getting a little bit hung up about the soil food web, and we didn't know enough about all the microbes in the soil. And it was really Gary Zimmer that said, you don't need to worry about it, just feed them. Do you know every microbe that is in a cow, in a cow's rumen? And we'd obviously been the highest yielding herd of cows in the country back in the 90s. So we'd got cows giving up to, one cow gave 18,000 kilos. And that's all about feeding the microbes and feeding the rumen. So he said, don't get hung up about that. You know how to feed cows. Start feeding your soil as you would feed cows, because at the end of the day, it's all about the microbes. So there's a direct synergy between ruminants and the soil, and the benefits of ruminants actually grazing the soil and working together in a synergy. So the big one here is when you think about the microbes and think about how microbes are actually made up, and when you think about the carbon-nitrogen ratio and how they're actually made up. And we know full well, if we feed a cow too much protein and you start getting high milk ureas coming through the cow, you've got problems. You've got foot problems, you've got fertility problems, respiration rates, everything is challenged. And it's exactly the same in the soil. And when you look at the carbon-nitrogen ratio of the bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes, you can see what soluble nitrogen is actually doing to the soil. So we've been throwing all this, and you know, I did it when I was a conventional farmer, but we've been throwing all this nitrogen around and burning, you know, we're basically nuking our soil bacteria. Yeah. So the loss of organic matter, certainly in the UK and in our area, where we've seen organic matters now drop down to sort of 1 and 2%, a lot of that is the liquid carbon because we're working with dead soils. And until we accept the damage that nitrogen fertilizer is actually doing to the soils, you know, we can't move forward. Yeah. On the Nuffield, there was an Australian terrier. He was another Nuffield scholar, and he said he was actually growing an inch of topsoil a year, and I couldn't get my head around that really. But he's not growing the soil, you know, up on top. He's actually growing it down below. And basically, a thread root on a plant can exert 300 psi. And what I'm using there is a soil penetrometer. So that indicates when you push down on the penetrometer, as soon as that hits 300 psi, that'll be your anaerobic zone. And with our deep, fertile soils, we've got an opportunity to grow our topsoils. You know, and people would say, oh, well, it takes 600 years to produce a soil. Well, yes, it does, but we've already got soil on our farm, and we've got to change that subsoil into topsoil, and we can do that with deep-rooting plants and the synergies that we've been talking about. You know, there are opportunities to use cultivation equipment, and on our system, we've now got an all-strong roller to break up a surface pan when we need to. So it's really important to get air into the soil, as Christine was saying this morning, because we've got the nitrifying bacteria in the soil, and then working with legumes, and we can actually get enough nitrogen out of the air. There's actually 74,000 tons of nitrogen above every hectare on this planet, which is absolutely massive. You know, the air that we're breathing is 78% nitrogen, and what gives us the right to be burning off carbon, turning it into nitrogen fertilizer when we don't actually need it. Yeah, so there's some big questions to ask, I think. So in terms of the system that we're running, and I don't say it's correct, and I think we'll be, you know, we're progressing going forward. We are on a paddock grazing system. Those are our yields at Keythorpe and at Glebe for the last 3 years, and turnout dates. So certainly the autumn calving herd, we want to feed them well through the winter, get them out to grass as quickly as possible, and then we'll be grazing through until, you know, early November. That's the plan there. We had an exceptional yield in grass yield in 2017. 2019, this year, we were actually in soil moisture deficit and through until about June time. So we just managed to get enough first cut silage off, and then the rain came and we actually made up quite a lot of ground then. But we've now adopted a fertilizer policy, and I hope that we can sort of maintain 9.5, 10 tons of dry matter organically, and that is with so our swards, they're not that diverse. I've got some light land that have got diverse swards in there, really diverse, with some cocksfoot and ryegrasses and plantains and chicory, a few other herbs, and then the clovers on the lighter land. In terms of the heavy ground, at this moment in time, we are putting some plantain in, and that seems to be going well. In terms of the chicory, it would seem that the chicory would like to be grazed on a 16, 18-day round, which maybe doesn't quite fit our optimum of 24, 20, 28-day round that we're grazing on at this moment in time. Yeah, so paddock grazing system, infill structures, vital, certainly to be getting out at those times a year. So we've got sleeper tracks. We've got 2 gateways, so 1 in, 1 out, so they're never going through the same gateway. In terms of the paddocks, they're sort of 24-hour paddocks, so we usually split those. And then over here we've got a stone track, and we've put astroturf down on those tracks just to help them walking. Yeah, so obviously water troughs in those paddocks. Anything else about paddocks? I was hoping to go through with the all-strong roller this back end because we had such a dry summer last time. We have got a little bit of surface compaction in certain areas, especially after the wet June. So, my son is actually doing his dissertation on soil compaction, so he's going to grab all the results for me, which should be great. So at the moment we're still grazing covers 2008 to 3000, maybe 3002, 3003 is maybe a bit high. Grazing at the third leaf. We'll go in, we'll take it down to the 1500. We'll then, in our fertilizer policy, we'll actually go on with a foliar feed after the third round. Fourth round we usually pre-mow or post-mow, and then sixth round we'll usually pre-mow or post-mow, and then we'll go in with another foliar feed on the fourth or fifth round, just depending on the conditions and whether we think we'll see the benefit from it. So in terms of conservation land for silage, yeah, grass is still very important to it. Grass and red clover, that's a field of grass and white, and then up in the top corner, that's an Italian ryegrass with red clover, but that's first cut, so you don't really see the red clover coming through on the first cut. Cutting dates, usually end of the first week of May, that's when we usually hit. Lucerne, been growing lucerne for long time now, and it was actually the crop that actually gave me the confidence to go organic in the first place, because I took soil analysis, all right, they were bog standard soil analysis, NPK indices, and we planted the crop of lucerne, and we had indices of sort of 2+ and 3 on the P and K. We actually had the lucerne in that field for 6 years. It was only meant to be 5, but it ended up as 6. And then when we finally took that crop out of lucerne, we analysed it again, and our indices were still up at the 3, and the only thing I'd put on there was lime. So it really highlighted to me, in terms of P and K, there's enough in the soil. We've just got to mobilise it. Smart establishment, we always establish the lucerne or the red clover under a whole crop. A fairly light whole crop in the spring. Don't establish any of the legumes in the autumn. We find on our land, we go into the autumn with too small a crop, and then everything likes to eat it over the winter months. So it needs to be established in the spring. And then in terms of quality protein, it's true to protein. The lucerne can't really get a much better protein source for a herbivore, as I see it. Red clover, so in a dry time the lucerne does better, but in a wet time the red clover will do a bit better, so having the mix of the both. And I'm actually growing stands and putting the red clover and lucerne in the same field now, but we've been in there for 3 years, and it would look as though they outcompete each other. But we'll see how it moves within the field over the years, because I wanted to get more diversity in there, but in reality there's a phytotoxin effect between some of the legumes and some of the plants. So red clover, again, established in the spring. The red clover will suppress the weeds better than the lucerne, we find, but it certainly builds fertility. But the most important thing to remember about the legumes is you've got to have free calcium in your soil. If you're trying to grow legumes successfully, and really it's a bit of a no-brainer, all these crops ought to be on all dairy farms or all livestock farms, because here's a protein source that we can get up to 14 tons of dry matter per hectare off these crops, with very little input, if any. Yeah, we do actually put slurry on the red clover and the grass after the cuts of silage. And then in terms of the grazing platform, we'll only go on the grazing platform when we finish grazing or very early season. So it'll get 1 dose of slurry, and then the grazing platform looks after itself for the rest of the season. Yeah, fodder beet. Fodder beets are it is a key crop for us. It's a bit of a pain to grow organically, but we harvested 10 days ago, and it actually did just on the 30 tonnes per acre. Last year it did about 24, the year before it did about the 30 tonnes, so we're actually learning how to grow it now. It does take some growing, so basically what we'll do, we'll take a red clover or a grass. After the third cut silage, we're on a four cut system, so after the third cut, we'll then go through, we'll bust it up with a set of discs, we'll then drill it with a sky drill with a cover crop, which will be oats, fodder radish and winter vetch. So that'll be a cover crop that goes through the winter. We'll then go in and we'll muck it and plough it late winter, early spring. We'll then stale seed bed it. We might put some gypsum on, depending on our soil structure, because gypsum will make the soil flocculate. You know, the particles within the soil flocculate, and we can end up with cleaner beet. We'll put salt in the seed bed. We'll then drill it. We'll then go on with slurry, just as it's emerging, to knock the flea beetle back. And a lot of the conventional guys don't realise that flea beetles don't like slurry and they don't like the smell of ammonia, and that's really key to our establishment. So we'll go on twice just at establishment, and this year I would say we would have got 95% establishment, I guess, this year, which I was really pleased with. We'll then hoe it twice. We'll then put a foliar feed of salt on in mid-July. So there's quite a lot of input to it. But the fodder beet for us, it's a massive yield of energy. And actually the cows will eat another whatever we put in terms of dry matter with the fodder beet, the cows will just eat it on top of what they're already eating. So we can see an increase in dry matter of about 2 kilos of dry matter as soon as we start feeding the fodder beet. So what happens is the grass comes out of the diet, the fodder beet is going into the diet. That goes in 3 weeks to a month before service. So the cows actually have a massive boost of energy prior to service, and then they, really start bulling well at that point. The other end, the fodder beet's coming out, the grass is going in, and off we go again. So we've always got a succulent in there driving intakes. Oats. Oats are a really valuable crop. They've been seriously underestimated in their value in conventional ag, as I see it, and it was partly because they weren't developing the markets and they weren't developing the varieties that could yield as well as wheat. But oats are brilliant at mobilising P and K, so we'll be using oats. So this is actually a stand of organic oats that did 3 tonne to the acre after. That was after a grass and clover lay. So we can get some serious yields. And all right, we do utilise we do utilise quite a lot of nutrition growing a crop of 3 tonne of oats, but actually we can reset that field fairly quickly. Up here you've got cover crops. So all the cover crops that I grow have either got oats or rye in them because they're so good at mobilising the P and K. And what you've actually got the P and K in a bioavailable form that can then be put into the soil and utilised by other plants really effectively. So oats are really valuable to us. And then the whole crops that we grow on farm. So we're growing, it's a mix of oats, barley, peas, beans and vetch. And so that'll go in after the fodder beet, and then we'll oversow that. So we'll plant that one day, the next day we'll roll it, or the same day, and then we'll go in and overseed with the red clover, white clover, lucerne and grass. So it's a massive old mix, big diverse mix. In terms of the weeds, there's no competition from weeds. You've got big seeds that you're actually planting, and we can end up with a 15-tonne fresh weight crop per acre in about 100 days. And it actually feeds really well because you've got the mix of the proteins and the energies. The plants work in synergies. You don't see any disease as as was already said today. So the synergies of plants are really, really valuable, and I think we can take that to the next level going forward. Photosynthesis basically fuels all life on Earth, and the point I want to make here, there's sometimes an argument to say that pigs and chickens are so much more efficient than the cows and the sheep. But when you consider a grass plant will capture 4 times the amount of carbon compared to a wheat plant, okay? So the cows and the sheep are actually eating grass that's already captured 4 times the amount of carbon, and then they're saying a pig is twice as efficient and a chicken is 4 times as efficient as a cow eating grass or a sheep eating grass. There's an equation there that nobody really wants to address, because that wheat plant that those chickens and pigs are eating has only captured 1/4 of the carbon, and yet everybody would say, oh, they're far more efficient than the ruminants, and that's not the case, and we need to get that message out there. Yeah, and we've already heard, a well-managed grass sward can actually capture as much carbon and cycle as much carbon as trees and the rainforest. Okay, the rainforest is storing carbon, but as farmers we need to be capturing sunlight and cycling carbon and turning it into food. And I'm afraid the vegans and the veggies need to understand that ruminants are a vital part of our planet, and they will be going forward, and it's going to be far better that we actually eat them and utilise them. The main difference between us and gorillas is that we started eating animal fats, and the gorillas carried on sitting in the woods eating seeds and nuts. And it's really important for our brain function, and that was alluded to earlier in terms of the omega-3s. For our brain and our neurons to work in our head, we actually need animal fats. And that's why the dairy cow is sacred around the world, or in some places of the world, because she's producing a renewable source of animal fat. Yeah. We've got to keep it green, so if we want to maximise photosynthesis, we've got to keep it green. So up here, this was destructing the red clover and then going in with the cover crop. So these 3 pictures are the same field, actually, same year. So that's us. We went through with a disc, a Heliodor, busted up a little bit, gone in with a cover crop. That's the cover crop. So that's oats, fodder radish, and winter vetch. That's it, just before we muck it and plough it, and that'll be ploughed in. That was just another field of oats that we were ploughing in. So I don't have too much of an issue with ploughing. In some ways, I'd like to get away from it, and that's maybe one of the limitations of the organic farming and weeds and how we actually do that. And I think I can be smarter in how we do that going forward, and certainly there's some technology out there that's really going to help us with that. But in terms of ploughing, if we're actually feeding that biology with a massive amount of green material, those soil bacteria are going to repopulate very quickly. So if you're ploughing, think about what you're ploughing down to feed all these living organisms that are below soil. This is just harvesting fodder beet, and then that's a cover crop there, and that's just a field of oats. Again, we're actually drilling with a sky drill. I like the sky drill because we can put the seeds down at different heights, and it has now actually got a liquid fertilizer tank on their front, so we're putting molasses down with the seed. And then in the autumn when we grow, so we're growing about 450 acres of oats over at Peterborough, the new farm, but we don't actually roll it. We go in with a high seed rate. So we're going in at sort of 85 kilos per acre, or 210 kilos per hectare. So I'm looking for apical dominance. I don't want lots of tillers. I want apical dominance, a big root system. We will go on with a feed of sulfur early on in the season just to help it along. And we've been averaging 2.4 tons of organic oats over there since we've been there. Gary Zimmer, those who came last year will recognise him. He was a great guy, as I said. He really put it all together for me, really. But he was absolutely adamant about cover crops, keeping everything green, and you know he basically gave me a lot of the ideas which I'm now putting into place on farm. But basically, maximising photosynthesis, feeding and protecting soil biology at all times. And then mob grazing, well, we're going to hear about mob grazing tomorrow, so won't focus too much on this, but that was out in Denmark, and they were grazing, that was 500 plain dairy steers, grazing covers at this sort of height, moving them on a daily basis. But basically, at that point, when you're grazing at those sort of covers, the plant has actually mobilised a lot of the trace nutrients into the seed head. They're then trampling about 40% in. The roots die back, energises the soil biology. All the organic matter is sitting there on top. The soil biology are breathing in air. They're giving off CO2, and actually that's why the stomata are on the underside of the leaf, so that the plants can capture the CO2 coming out of the ground, which the microbes are breathing out. So that's how it's meant to work. But we can actually sort out soils pretty darn quickly. With mob grazing, with a collaboration between livestock and arable farmers. And I think the arable boys are starting to understand that now. Plant diversity and synergies will take agriculture to the next level. That was basically a botanist in Sweden, a chap called Olaf Larsson. He was a dairy farmer as well. This was his mix there. And you could say I've probably nicked his mix, but that was basically spring wheat, spring beans, spring oats, and then that was undersown with a lot of timothy out there, red clover, white clover, and there was a bit of lucerne in there as well. But what he was doing, he was actually combining that, and that was his feed for his cows. And he was milling it, he was drying it and milling it. And that's where I'd like to get to with our whole crops, is actually taking it to that next step and actually combining it and taking more control back into our farming system. Up there, that was chicory and plantain on the one farm down in New Zealand. That was looking really well, actually. And there was no grass in that, and the cows were doing really well on it. This was spring lupin, spring wheat, spring peas. Again, another organic guy. That was his cereal. He was actually heat treating it on farm. So he had a big auger and a fire, very crude, but that was his heat treated cereal that he was feeding to his cows, and he was doing 9,500 litres organically. And yeah, he was the one who had the new flash car and the new kit. So he was actually doing a good job. Red clover and lucerne. Bit of a no-brainer. They've got to be on all farms. This was actually, this was down in New Zealand, and this was a ley that had, it surprised me really, because it didn't look very special, but actually the bricks on that was up at the 18, 19, so it was, it was in pretty good form. Composting, this was down in Australia. And basically they got a collecting yard. They were scraping the slurry off the collecting yard. They were mixing it with wood chip. So this was, it wasn't recycled wood chip, it was straight from trees. So they were mixing that, they were windrowing it, they were getting heat into it to start to break down that wood chip. And then once the temperature started dropping, they would actually start to add some mineral. So these were on very high magnesium soils, so they needed a lot of free calcium, so they were adding calcium. They were also taking some of the soil off their best paddocks and putting that into the windrows, and they were adamant that they were making a live fertilizer and the effects, they were 10 times more effective than putting that slurry straight out onto the grazing platform. So I think there's there's some massive benefits that we can do on farm with a bit of work. And we are composting. We need to do it better, but we're certainly working at it. Going forward. And then the foliar feed. This was Jeff Williamson. He was down at Palmerston North in New Zealand, so he'd been a high input, high output guy on sort of 11,000 litres. The reality was all his margin was going out the gate, so he had to readdress what he was doing. Took his base saturation levels, saw that he was high magnesium, put in diverse swards, and he got herbal lays. And he was a little bit concerned that the plantain was getting ahead of him a little bit, because it tends to put up a seed head, so you've got a massive seed bank in his soils. But his lays actually looked well. His cows, the muscle integrity on his cows was exceptional. But what he was doing, he was putting in a carbon source, so he was using humates, minerals. Again, he was high mag, so he was putting calcium carbonate in there. He was then putting molasses in there, and he wasn't organic, so he was using fertilizer and he was using urea in this tone fert machine, and he'd actually dropped his nitrogen usage from 240 kilos of N down to 40, and he was still doing 16.5 tons of dry matter per hectare, which was measured by Lincoln University. So, certainly by changing the soil and changing the plants that we actually grow on farm, the reliance on nitrogen fertilizer can drop dramatically. And when you consider nitrogen fertilizer, at best 60% is utilized, it's just, needs to be addressed. So, Keythorpe, this is what we're doing. So it's usually the third round and fourth, or third and fifth. It just depends a little bit on the season. But we're going in with molasses, so an energy source, liquid seaweed, Epsom salts. So there's our magnesium, some sulfur in there. But you can see on that paddock, that's quite an old picture actually. But you can see on that paddock, it's fairly light green. And so we need that magnesium to go on there to make sure that we get the chlorophyll up in the plant and it photosynthesizes at a higher rate. And then slurry, as I said, we're going sort of off the grazing season on the platform, and then most of that is going onto silage ground, and then we've got the compost as well. So high quality mineral dense food can only be produced on healthy soils. And I think, that's where there's an awful lot of issues. And I was in New Zealand in 2013, and I actually thought the model was pretty broken at that point. 70% of their rivers were actually polluted with nitrogen. They weren't fit to swim in. The cow health, had deteriorated. I wasn't over impressed with the cow health, and I think that was the most noticeable thing when I went around. And I should quantify it. There were some very good conventional New Zealand farmers out there where they had got it about right. But going from conventional to organic, the muscle integrity, the quality of the coat, the brightness of eye on the organic farms was always higher than that on the conventional farms. And I think a lot of it is due to, this over-reliance on nitrogen fertilizer. And I think it's a bit worrying for, Ireland, because the New Zealand model was adopted, and people don't want to address the nitrogen issue and the effect that it's having, and the production of empty calories. And when you think about GM technology and the first GM technology, I think there's some GM technology which could be very good for us in the future. Yeah, so my advice, if I was to convert to organic farming now, it would be a far easier conversion than it was when I converted. I just went cold turkey in effect and waited to see what happened. I know an awful lot more now, and we can do an awful lot to not see that dip in production as I saw it. But we need to basically know your base saturation levels, know where your cow-mag ratio is. You can't necessarily change it, but at least if you know, you're informed and you can do something about it. Feed and nurture soil biology as a priority. So if you are going to plough, just think about the implications of ploughing and make sure there's something for that biology to feed on. Use plant and soil microbe diversity, and as Christine was saying this morning, the soil microbe diversity doesn't come without the plant diversity, and I think that'll be my take-home message today, that if I want to actually increase my soil microbe diversity, I've got to get more plants into the system. Maximise on-farm manures and make live mineral-rich fertilizers. I think we can do that. Shouldn't be a problem. And then I think there's the collaboration with the livestock and arable farmers going forward. We just need to work together a bit more. But as I see it, I'm not actually pushing organic farming as the panacea because it's very restrictive in some areas, but certainly biological farming is the future. Thank you.